Thank you all so much for being here today for our lecture with Dr. Robert Ritner on the mysteries of Osiris. My name is Izzy Fuqua. I'm the adult programs coordinator for the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts, and I've had the delight to work with our curator at the museum, Dr. Peter Schertz, to coordinate this 5-part lecture series on our current special exhibition. Peter, I will turn it over to you to introduce our speaker.
Okay. Thanks, Izzy, and thank you to your colleagues in the Education Department, especially Lulan and Celeste and Courtney, for helping to arrange these lectures. And I'd like to thank the Whitfield Foundation and the Archaeological Institute of America Richmond chapter for co-sponsoring and making this talk possible. It's going to be an amazing talk. It's going to be a lot of fun because Professor Ritner will be talking about the myth of Osiris. It's a myth that's just filled with illicit loves and sibling rivalries, murder and rebirth. And if any of you are nervous about murder and rebirth, you've been warned, or about illicit love, I guess. But our speaker comes to us from the Oriental Institute of the University of Chicago. He's had a wonderful career, especially researching ancient Egyptian religion and magic. In fact, one of his books was called Ancient Egyptian Magical Practices. And he was also involved in the study of the Joseph Smith Egyptian papyri, which he was just telling me about, was also quite fascinating. Professor Ritner has been deeply immersed in the study of Egyptian religion and literature. He's had many opportunities to contemplate the myth of Osiris, and that's the topic of today's lecture, Remembering Osiris. So thank you, Robert, for coming, and I'm so looking forward to this.
Great. Well, it is a great pleasure to be with the Virginia Museum in Richmond, if only at a remote distance. And the topic that I will be describing today will be keyed to the wonderful exhibit that you have. And I'm sorry that I'm not there to actually visit it and take it in firsthand. It is, as Peter mentioned, an X-rated discussion because of the nature of the Egyptian ritual involved with bringing back to life the god Osiris, and in this case, literally putting his body parts together or remembering him. Now, the title of your exhibit is The Sunken Cities, but Egypt as a country was a land of potential sunken cities until the building of the first Aswan Dam by the British in the 1800s. The Egyptian Nile Valley flooded every single year. And here you can see an old photograph where the waters have come almost up to the pyramids. This is why Egyptian cities are built high up away from the fertile land. Otherwise, they would be perpetually underwater on an annual basis. Now, that annual flooding is so important that it determined the Egyptian calendar. And that ancient Egyptian calendar is, surprisingly enough, so appropriate for the Egyptian agricultural life of the country. It is still the one that is used in modern Egypt today. It's sounded out, and rather than using the traditional Arabic calendar, which is irrelevant to Egypt specifically. So the 4th month of the year, and you can see the table, Arabic, Coptic, Greek, and Egyptian, all of these are renderings of the ancient Egyptian month of Khoiak. And that will be the month that we are concerned with. This is the month in which the waters are beginning to recede, and it is now time to plant and create new vegetation for the next year. So Arabic Kiak, which is what you would say in modern Egypt today, Coptic Khoiak, Greek Khoiak, and ancient Egyptian Kaharkat, which is a little hard to say if you don't like to put a lot of aspiration into your voice. Now, the story of Khoiak and what takes place within it This is a ritual that essentially takes place from the first day of the month all the way to the 30th. So Egyptian has months that are 30 days long, and this process for the month of Koyak includes all of those days. And it concerns the cast of characters. Here you see the two primary characters, Isis on the left and her husband, Osiris, whose primary role in this is to die. You have actually these two statues. They're from about 600 BC, particularly nice statues from the Saite period, from the Cairo Museum. The third party in this drama is the god Seth, who is their common brother. Osiris was king of the universe in this primordial time, and by universe I mean Egypt. But Seth, his brother, coveted his position. So what he did was to throw a party for Osiris to celebrate his kingship. And as a party favor, he produced the world's first coffin, a mummy case. Now, at this point, no one had ever died. And he offered this as a favor to whoever might fit inside it. Well, he had carefully recorded the dimensions of Osiris, so all the gods lined up, tried to fit inside the coffin, failed. Osiris fit, and Seth promptly rushed up to the coffin, slammed the case shut, and threw the coffin into the Nile, where Osiris died. End of the story for Osiris. Now, this motif of the mummy case at the dinner table became a standard feature of Egyptian parties forever afterwards, so that we can see it punned upon here in a cartoon from Punch magazine from the 1920s, in which a servant girl is saying how much better their festival is here than most parties because, and she says at the last remark, we have the smartest undertaker in Thebes to trot round the mummy. And you can see the mummy up in the right-hand corner being carried through the dinner table, through the dinner party. All of this goes back to the myth of Osiris. And it also impacts our even modern art about ancient Egypt. So this was a painting entitled Pastime in Ancient Egypt by Lawrence Al-Matadema. This is a remarkably nice and authentic picture of a party, but it's lacking one thing. And when he repainted it in 1864, he added, you can see it tucked away in the shadows in the right corner, we now have the mummy case. Now, the problem is that Osiris is now drowned and he's floated from the Nile into the Mediterranean, and he floats all the way to the town of Byblos, where his body becomes encased in a tree, which is cut down and used to make a column in the palace of the local ruler of Byblos. The goddess Isis then goes in search of him by boat, lands at Byblos, and by various tricks is able to get the pillar out of the palace. And there you see her again in a statuette that we have in the museum. That's the little body of Osiris lying on her lap. By magic, she is going to resuscitate him, except Seth finds them hiding in the swamps of the Delta, and he cuts Osiris's body up into 14 pieces and scatters them around the world. Whereupon Isis has to go back into the sea and revisit her travels and go do this all over again, finding all the body parts one by one, except one. One part she could not find, that was the penis of Osiris, so she magically made that. And then taking on the form of a vulture, she landed on this magically created penis and became pregnant with Osiris's son Horus, who would then fight and ultimately defeat Seth. That's the core of the myth. Now, when Isis had found these body parts, she contacted another son, a son of Osiris, the god Anubis, who is a jackal-formed god, jackal-faced, jackal-bodied god, whose role in Egyptian theology is to become the first mummifier. This is the one who would be trotting around the body at the future festivals. Here you can see him sitting on the chest that holds the internal organs from the tomb of Tutankhamun. Here is the god Anubis actually performing the mummification of the god Osiris. Every Egyptian hoped to share in the fate of Osiris so that after death, they would actually be part of the corporate personality of Osiris and addressed as the Osiris so-and-so. So this is a scene from a private tomb in Deir el-Medina, but it represents both the god Osiris in this early mythological time, and also the tomb owner who hoped to share the same event. Now, the actual mummification is described in detail in a late papyrus in Jumilak. Here you can see Osiris on both the left and the right, and on the left-hand example, all the body parts are shown there separated one by one, including the head and the magically restored penis, the heart underneath that, and the legs, the fingers, and the two what look like sickles in the lower bottom are the two halves of the jaw, the rami of the jaw, the stack of ribs, the eyes, etc. Now, the interesting piece that is immediately to the left of the heart and the phallus, directly under the head, is the jet column, which is actually the os sacrum, the sacred bone. In modern medical terminology, it is an extremely important piece for Egyptian thought because it was thought to be the tailbone. But the raising up of that bone was what signified the stability and endurance and resurrection of Osiris, as we shall see in just a moment. So when we see depictions of the risen Osiris, you'll notice he has a green face. This is not because he is a Martian, but because he represents vegetation. And so, which is a point we'll be going back to over and over again. And so his face is colored green to match the flourishing vegetation, which rises up from his risen body. In effect, when he is cut to pieces by Seth, the efflux, the fluids that flow out of his severed body are thought to be the ones that swell the Nile, causing the Nile flood. And the receding of that and his resurrection is what causes the rebirth of grain and plants. Now, to further emphasize that, you have an offering of plants right in front of Osiris on the left and on the right. And on either side, you see a very unusual symbol known as the Imi-Ut. And that we'll look at more carefully. You'll notice it has a central staff with a plant coming up from a pot. There is an animal skin tied to that plant. And there is another green plant that's springing up from that. Here's another example of that. You can see a little more clearly here that what is tied to the pole with the plant is actually a flayed animal skin. And you can see the cow markings on the spots there. And what this refers to is the ancient idea that you would be buried by being wrapped in an animal skin. So here's an animal skin, the pre-mummification coffin burial device, strapped to a growing plant, and then a second one that comes up spurting directly from the cowhide. Here is the example from Tutankhamun's gilded tomb. And again, you can see the tail here of the flayed animal skin actually transforms into this lotus flower. What this represents is the transition from death and the coffin into life, specifically plant life, so that even the flayed dead animal can become a symbol of life. And this is the motif that actually is associated with both Anubis and Osiris. So here we see it schematically shown on the far left. And inside that animal skin, which you'll notice the top ends again in a lotus flower, you can see all those body parts. And directly to the right of it is a pot from which is sprouting grain. And that will be the subject of much of the talk today. So here again is Osiris putting together those body parts. I mentioned the Jed column. I want to talk about that just a little more, because the Jed column can all by itself represent the risen Osiris, just the backbone representing his renewed existence. And here, in lieu of a head, the statue of Osiris has the upper part of the Jed column. Those are actually pieces of the spine in terms of Egyptian thought at this period. However, so here we can see the risen Osiris in mummy form, with Isis and his other sister Nephthys flanking him. Here, these are jewels from Tutankhamun, and here is another one where the mummy of Osiris has now been replaced by the Jed column. So it's a symbol of the rebirth of Osiris, and this spinal column in the later idea is, however, not really the origin, because we have pre-dynastic from around 3000 BC examples of the very first Jed columns. And what they show us is that image is actually a maypole. So what you have here is a pole to which branches have been tied, and at the bottom one you can actually see the rounded rope that is holding them on. So at the end of the festival of Koyak, what one does is raise this pole with the branches on it, and that represents the resurrection both of the spine of Osiris, his body, and new vegetation sprouting from this pole. So the resurrection of Osiris is the resurrection of vegetation. Now, you can see that even more clearly in some of the reliefs from Dendera, which we'll talk about in just a moment. But here is the body of Osiris lying within that tree of Byblos. And you get the same motif in a little stela that is in now the Richmond Museum, where the tree is sprouting from a tomb in which Osiris is found. That's the name Osiris in hieroglyphs, direct in a little mound directly beneath that tree. So not only is it a reference to the Byblos tree, but it's a reference to the vegetation which will spring up from the dead body, the tomb of Osiris. So it's doing double duty. Now I mentioned Dendera, and this is one of the most important sites in Egypt today, and it's particularly helpful for understanding the myth of Koyak, because we actually have almost all the necessary details for the step-by-step festival activities of Koyak. And it takes place not in the main body of the temple, and the area is huge, and the walls are standing, the temple is roofed. This is one of the best preserved temples in Egypt. But that's what it looks like. What you can't see from that facade is that it has roofed chapels which are intact. And here is the layout of them. There's 3 on the east, that is on the right-hand side, and there are another 3 on the left, which is the west side. And when you go out the door of the left side, you go down a staircase, and you'll see there's a staircase on the right-hand side, which comes up. We'll talk about that. The ritual actually starts on the right-hand side with going up those stairs, going into rooms 1, 2, and 3. When you are in the back of room 3, the ritual then jumps not to the first one on the left-hand side, as you might think, but it starts up at the back wall. You magically transition from the back wall of one side to the back wall of the other, and then you come out the left 3 and then down the stairs. So what happens? Well, in that first chapel, we have over 150 lines of text that describe in excruciating detail all the things needed for this ceremony that lasts a month. And it has at the bottom a little illustration to go along with the instructions. So if we go to the close-up of the illustration, we can see what this activity is all about. So what you've got there in a rectangle is a figure of the god Osiris, who is said in the text to be made of mud. And the hieroglyphic text directly above his knees is actually telling you the height of the mud figure. So it's fairly small because it's only 3 palms and 3 fingers thick or high. And the box is labeled directly above Osiris's stomach as being a garden vat. So this is a clay figure, which is small, which is put into a vat. And then on the edge of the vat, you can see groups of 3 plants that recur over and over again across the whole length of that upper edge of the rectangle. Those images would actually be painted or carved on the side of this large stone vat. And those again represent the growing vegetation which will come out of this vat from the body of Osiris, which is made not merely of clay, but it is seeded with new grain seeds, which will be carefully watered and which will sprout over the course of this month. And those are what represents the birth of Osiris. We're essentially helping him regenerate himself by making these little images of Osiris, and you make lots of them. And they are going to be tended, watered, then ultimately mummified, put in, given amulets, Book of the Dead spells will be read over them. A ritual drama defeating Seth will be performed. There will be sailings of boats to recreate the Isis wanderings. And then finally, the procession led by the king and the priests will take the old ones out and bury them. Those are the ones from last year. And the new ones will sit in the chapel in the special revered place for the next year. And this is done every year for this month. So the staircase that I showed you on the right includes a procession of all the major priests of Egypt led by the king. And the last figure coming up those stairs, coming through the doorway actually, is actually the first one in the doorway, is the god Anubis, rolling a disc, more of which in a moment. You'll notice that he has to be helped along by someone holding a stick to sort of keep the disc in play. I'll explain why in a minute. So there's what it actually looks like now, the carving. And the reason is that that Anubis figure is actually a priest wearing a mask, and so his vision is obscured. And so he needs a partner to sort of help him along. This is the scene coming out of that same room. This is chapel number 1. And there we can see the priest is actually reaching out and holding the man. And perhaps you can see, and I'll show you more clearly in just a moment, this is one of the rare examples of a priest shown wearing a mask, because here you can see the human head inside the Anubis mask. This is what it actually looks like. These are examples of surviving Anubis masks in both the Louvre and in Hildesheim in Germany. You'll notice, by the way, in the one in Hildesheim, the eye holes are underneath the spout of the snout. So that's why you might need a little help walking around, especially when you're climbing stairs. And here is a published photograph of the scene where you can see the human head inside the mask. And there's a line drawing of it. So the importance of Anubis is that he is going to be the figure who mummifies, just as he mummified the actual body of Osiris, a priest imitating him will mummify all of these many, many, many little figurines. And I will show you lots of them in a moment. And the end result, and why you have a disc, is that Osiris is identified with the moon. The 14 pieces into which Osiris was cut up correspond to the 14 stages of the regeneration of the moon. The gathering together of Osiris corresponds to the 14 phases of the moon before it becomes a full moon. And here you can see the full moon in the center over the doorway. And the last chapel, which represents the culmination of this ritual, where Osiris has come forth in the sky as the moon. And so here we have actually a text from that chapel which describes exactly what's going on. Osiris wakes up from sleep. He takes his place in the sky as the waxing moon. He flies off as the phoenix and the moon. So in order to do that, we have multiple scenes of Anubis actually involved in the embalming of multiple scenes of Osiris, which corresponds to the multiple little figurines that you are making. You'll notice a whole series of these. I'll show you in more detail. One thing I would draw your attention to is this wall scenes regularly have in the Ptolemaic period, and that's where we have these. This chapel was begun under the reign of Cleopatra the Great. The ceilings were finished off by Augustus Caesar. But the bottom line at the very baseline is an artificial temple wall. And the reason why I point that out is we'll see it in an unusual papyrus a little later. So that's what it actually looks like. That's the line drawing of the scene you just saw. And you will notice in the top center, we have Osiris lying on his bed, Isis and Nephthys are on either side, and Anubis is in the process of embalming him. And if you go down to the lower level, you see again the same sort of scene, flanking. We have also a whole series of subordinate scenes in these chapels in which Osiris is shown coming back to life. On the far left, he's got one hand up to his face. This is waking up like waking up in the morning where you rub your face. He's now rubbing his face after death as a reborn god. Now in the middle, we have a particularly important scene in which there is a bird hovering over Osiris. This can be made a little more graphic in some of the other scenes that we'll get to in just a moment. So here we can see Osiris in the act of actually raising up on his bier, where he is coming to life. And you'll notice there's a tree which is coming to life on the left-hand side. On the right, he's in his tomb, and you'll notice there is the bird which is perched directly over the roof of the tomb, which is the goddess Isis waiting to actually copulate with him. And that's what we can see here, again, in the scenes from this on the, in these rooftop chapels. If you look at the bottom left, we can see the bird coming in for the process of copulation. And in the middle, we have Osiris actually with his erection. there is that scene right there. Now, underneath the Osiris bed, you will notice there are a group of little 4 figures, and then correspondingly, we have 4 jugs with different heads, human and animal. And those correspond to the figures here, going back to Papyrus Jumelak, of the 4 sons of Horus. Now, the sons of Horus, their role is to preserve the individual internal organs. The Egyptians didn't leave those in when they mummified because they would rot more quickly, so they were removed and embalmed separately in little jars, which are curiously enough known as canopic jars because of a mistake by early Egyptologists. They have absolutely nothing to do with Canopus, which is a town we'll be talking about at the end of this lecture, and I'll show you a real canopic jar. But I and my colleagues are forced to use the term canopic jar for something that has nothing to do with Canopus. This term Canopus actually comes from Greek mythology. The early Egyptologists knew there was this captain of Menelaus who was buried at Canopus and worshipped in the form of a jar, and so they assumed these jars were that jar. Well, no, but we're stuck with the name. Now here we can see the same kind of scene that we can find at Dendera, and it on the left-hand side, it's on a papyrus. You'll notice we have at the bottom that little wall scene again, running along the line at the base, which shows that this is a copy from a temple wall. We can see Osiris on a bed. There's the 4 canopic jars. And we should have had Anubis on the left-hand side. You'll note the dark skin. Well, unfortunately, the papyrus was broken. When Joseph Smith bought this in the 1830s from a traveling salesman moving through Kirtland, Ohio, he thought it was a piece of scripture, and he restored the head as a human head, put in his hand a knife, put 2 hands up, and instead of the bird hovering over the phallus of Osiris, he's got a knife there. He misunderstood this and produced from this scene a gospel that's in the Pearl of Great Price book. And this is the so-called Book of Abraham, in which Abraham was being sacrificed by a priest of Ur following Egyptian sacrificial methods. All of this is wrong. The way it should actually look is on the right-hand side, a reconstruction of the way this scene would have appeared, where it makes perfectly good sense. And you notice the 1 hand up corresponds directly to the 1 hand up that we saw in the scenes at Dendera. So an interesting bit of American history making use of these scenes from Khoiak, though unrecognized until I recently wrote 2 books on the subject. So here we can see the scenes again, just to remind you of what that papyrus should have looked like. Here's the Dendera scene. There's Anubis in the upper left with his hands up. There is a bird hovering over the erect phallus of Osiris, and Osiris with 1 hand to his head as he wakes up. Here then is the splayed out activities for the month of Khoiak from various different sites. Primarily what you were doing in that first chamber is watering the image over and over and over again until it sprouts. So you don't, for the first 20 days, you are basically watering. In some, well, in the town of Koptos, you water longer than you do, for example, in Dendera. Here is an example from Karnak, showing how the ritual was performed there. It's being performed not just in Dendera, not just in Koptos, but in all the major temples in all of Egypt. And so there's going to be some slight variation in the process. But here at Karnak, we can see the priest watering the figurine of Osiris, grain sprouting up from it. This is a drawing of that very same scene. Now, here are a group of objects that are used in the Koyak ceremony. And this was the frontispiece for the primary publication that translated all of these texts through these chapels by Émile Chassinon. And this is now being used as a backdrop for one of the exhibit cases in Richmond. So you can see this picture with some of these actual objects. The things primarily to note are at the top, you have vessels for the pouring of water or the carrying of the sacred water. You have ladles on either side for dipping that water. The boat procession directly below that, more pouring items. And at the bottom, that's an incense burner for sensing the final product. Now, these examples were also recently discovered by Frank Godillot off the site of the real Canopus. Here you can see the divers with one of these garden vats that was used to hold the mummies. And on the right, one of many examples of a ladle that were found in the water, because the whole town of Canopus sank. Now, here is your finished product. Again, going back to that papyrus Jumelak that we've seen several times. So there's Osiris with the grain sprouting from him, and you'll notice that something else sprouts because the two sprouts are considered to be identical. That's why you regularly show him with an erect penis. The penis corresponds to the jutting forth of the vegetation. I warned you this would be X-rated. Now that motif is extremely common. So here we have a scene from a coffin, and here you can see the vegetation actually coming up from the body of Osiris. The same sort of thing occurs in private tombs and royal tombs. So on the left, the private tomb of Maiher Perry, who was a prominent individual and even got a tomb in the Valley of the Kings. There is a bed, and the hollowed out part has been packed with dirt and with seeds, which were designed to sprout in the tomb. When it sprouts in the tomb, it represents the resurrection not only of Osiris, but the tomb owner himself. In the middle, you see that Tutankhamun had exactly the same sort of thing, but here it's shaped in the shape of Osiris. And on the right, we have another example. This is from the tomb of Horemheb, who is the last member of the Dynasty 18, that same dynasty as all of these figures are Dynasty 18. Now, the examples that are being produced in the month of Koyak in the temples look a little different. Here you can see an example from the Metropolitan Museum. There's the figure in the little clay designed to sprout. Here is an example from reconstruction in the Louvre with the sprouting having taken place. Here are examples. These are the old and reburied examples that are done on the last day of the month when you take from old completed mummies who've spent their time as the mummy of the year, and you bury them in a special necropolis. Well, we have a whole series of these that were found, and they were in various museums around the world, including Cairo. And here you can see an example from Cairo. Here's another one, which is a little more evocative of the intention. Also Cairo. This is from Leiden. Here we have the British Museum, I believe. And all of these things represent the resurrection of Osiris. So there are many, many of these because you produce them by the hundreds. And there is that act of resurrection of Osiris rolling over on his side to wake back up. And this you also have in the exhibit, because here we have a statue, one of the really nice statues from the Cairo Museum, in which Osiris has rolled over on his stomach and is in the process of waking up, as you can see from his face with his eyes open. You can actually visit this and see it in the museum. Now, in order to understand all of this, we can go back to an earlier site from the time of Seti I, around 1200 BC. And there is now at a different site. This is the town of Abydos. This is entirely visitable by tourists, but this is a sacred space in the back of the temple of Seti I at Abydos. And this shows the same scenes we saw at Dendera, but is hundreds of years older. So here we can see a scene that you now recognize. This is in the back special chamber, which was off limits to most Egyptians. Only the priests could ever see this. And here you see Osiris' left hand up, waking up and holding his erect penis. Here we can see the actual copulation, where Isis in the form of a bird is sitting on the penis which she herself made after she reconstructing the body of Osiris. And she is now becoming pregnant with the god Horus, who is not yet born. But in mythological time, you can bin time, because on the left-hand side, you see Horus watching himself being conceived. And that scene of Isis copulating can be found in multiple scenes. So here we have a line drawing. You'll notice that often the penis has been hacked out by either Christian or Arabic followers. By followers, I mean people who came afterwards. So the X-rated character was recognized at earlier times. But in all of these scenes, the bottom two are from Dendera again. And the one on the upper right is on a private coffin, showing Osiris actually ejaculating, producing, and again, the Nile flood. And the most important example of this scene of Osiris impregnating Isis comes from the tomb of King Den, a tomb that was Dynasty I at Abydos. But the piece that you were looking at, which was placed in that early dynastic tomb, this is of a much later date. It is still argued back and forth as to whether this is the Saite dynasty, roughly 600 BC, or Dynasty 13, about 1700 BC, because all of the text and the names have been totally hacked out. Who at some point after it was placed there, someone else coveted it, and maybe they put their name on in paint, which is gone. But the original donor's name is so badly damaged that it's very, very difficult to determine who actually did this. But this is the most sacred object from Egypt. It was placed with what was thought to be, in later times, by the New Kingdom, it was assumed that this pre-dynastic tomb was actually the physical tomb of Osiris. And this monument was there to be that. So this is the most sacred image from Egypt, and I am shocked that Egypt actually allowed it out of the country. Normally, this is under the atrium in the Cairo Museum. Tourists pass by this every day and have no clue just how important this is. But there you have the very scene that we've been talking about. This is the culmination of the rebirth that was placed in the most sacred place in Egypt. Now, I mentioned that some of the imagery that we've seen, some of the objects, came from the actual Canopus, and that is a focus also of this exhibit. Now, the town of Canopus was on the coast. The land subsided as a result of earthquakes and essentially vanished. It was known from monuments that we already have. You can see here both Canopus and its corresponding town, Thonis Heraklion, which is farther up the coast, not far away. Now, these two towns are ones that have been investigated by Frank Godiot, a French Egyptologist and underwater expert who has done a lot of work off Alexandria as well as here. He has made outstanding contributions to our understanding of coastal Egypt. We first knew about the existence of this town, Thonis, from this stela, which has long been known, but it came from Naucratis, which is farther in the delta, a city that was primarily settled by Greeks where they conducted trade. This is from the reign of Nectanebo the first, who is dynasty 30 from around 380 BC, when he was in his early years. One of the first things he did upon coming to office was to institute a 10% tax on all goods going in and out of Naucratis. So he allowed the Greek colony to function there, but he made a killing off of their work. And we have in it a mention of the 10% tax being imposed upon anything that comes through. And here I'm going to try a trick and see if I can expand this. I can't. When you go to the museum, the name of the city of Thonis is in the upper left. It's the first set of words in the last column on the left side below the picture. Egyptian reads primarily from right to left. So that actually says they're in the town of Tahinit. Tahinit is in Greek pronunciation Thonis. And Tahinit means the mistress, and it puns upon another Tahinit notion of Henet, which is canal. The word mistress and canal are pronounced the same way. And you notice the primary link between Canopus and its sister city, Thonis, is a canal, a major canal. Now, this city of Heraklion, which is the Greek name for Thonis, drawn from Greek mythology. It was believed that at some point Hercules, had in his labors wandered to Egypt, come into the delta, there encountered a king Osiris, who slaughtered any foreigner who set foot in the kingdom, and Hercules fought with him and ultimately killed him. That is a story that is actually recorded on a variety of Attic pots. And so when later Greeks came to Egypt, they decided that this coastal city must be the place that Hercules had been. And so they named it Heraklion, which has nothing to do with the local Egyptian cult whatsoever. It's just an artificially imposed name. The Egyptian name is Tahinit. But it became an important trading city and port because it was closer to the actual Mediterranean than Naucratis. Anything getting to Naucratis would basically have to stop and go through Tahinit or Thonis. And so it grew up with imagery designed to let anyone know that they were entering Egypt. And here you can see from the Ptolemaic period around these were probably around 118 BC. Ptolemy 8, I would guess, but that's not clear. Here we have a Ptolemaic king and queen in purely Egyptian style, which was put up along the coast to greet anyone coming into the town to trade. And there was a second stela that was just like the Naucratis stela, which was placed also right there on the shore, advising them in Egyptian that they'd be coming back. We also have, from the same area, this gigantic statue of the god Hapi, who is the god of the inundation and the Nile, and therefore intimately associated with what happens with Osiris. Now, all three of these colossal statues are now in the exhibit. Some years ago, when there was a Cleopatra exhibit in the year 2000, I had wanted to bring one or two of these to Chicago, and we did not have a space that was tall enough to put. So I'm glad to see they have finally made it to the United States, and they are in Richmond. So it is a very special set of exhibit pieces. Now, we also have, from this site, recovered the naos, the Holy of Holies, where the statue of the god would actually have been placed. You may notice that the roof of that chapel is actually a little pyramid. And the god who would have been inside that is the actual god Canopus. It's a form of the god Osiris who takes the shape of a jar. So in the month of Koyak in Canopus, the god that you ultimately figure and put in this as the center of the Holy of Holies is this god. And what is inside that jar? The sacred Nile water of the regenerating flood, which comes forth from the severed Osirian body parts. So this contains the sacred Nile water of Hapi. That's how those go together. And here you can see the finding of just such a jar off of Canopus by Godia. Here we have that in museum. Right? Sorry. The finding. Oops, I'm going in the wrong. Now, the interesting thing about these god Canopus of a mixed Egyptian and Greek city on the coast, which was a major port, is that the worship of Osiris spread under the Ptolemies throughout all of the Mediterranean. The Ptolemaic kingdom included control of the island of Cyprus, and it had international connections with other parts of Greece. And so temples would be built in Greece to Osiris, and they often took the form of the Osiris Canopus. And what you're seeing here is a statue of an Egyptian priest holding one of these canopic jars in the process of celebrating the festival of Osiris Canopus. And you'll notice that his tunic is over his hands because the jar is so sacred you can't actually touch it with your fingers. Now, this image can occur also in other surprising places. So we can see it from Upper Egypt in the town of Malawi. This was a statue in the local museum there. I took this photograph before the Arab Spring when there was a riot in this town and the museum was badly damaged and many of the pieces destroyed. I do not know whether this statue still exists. A number of years ago, there was a call for anyone who had pictures of the museum to put them online to try to reconstruct the original holdings of the Malawi Museum. And I put this up, and there's a close-up of the face with the vessel. But it's not merely within Egypt that one finds this image. I should mention that this is from Canopus itself, found by Godia. This was in Malawi in Middle Egypt. And this shows an Egyptian festival taking place in a temple that is not in Egypt. It's actually in Italy. So this is the temple at Herculaneum near Pompeii, a town like Pompeii that was destroyed by the eruption of the Vesuvius volcano. And the important thing to note is the figure who is in the doorway at the top, which is a figure of a priest. And what is he holding? It's the sacred Nile water in the form of the god Canopus. And in the town of Ostia, the Emperor Domitian commissioned an Egyptian temple to be made at his port, because this was a place where grain was being brought in from Egypt to support the Roman Empire, and an appropriate symbol of the sprouting grain that is going to feed Italy is, of course, Osiris Canopus. And here from Ostia, and now in the Benvenuto Museum, is a headless example of something we've now seen several times. This is again a priest holding the sacred Canopus vessel with imported Egyptian Nile water, both at Heraklion and here in Ostia, which is so sacred you dare not touch the vessel. And so this actually comes into the Western tradition, both in Greece and in Rome. And that is the unusual history of the month of Khoiak. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Robert. That was wonderful. So we do have quite a few questions. The first I wanted to start with was actually it times well with your last image. We've seen it quite a few times, this placement of the body and the way the figures are constructed with one foot being forward while the other is backward. I was wondering if you could speak to if there's any meaning to that kind of placement of the body.
The reason why the feet are in that position is that walking in Egyptian is stylized in statuary and even in the hieroglyphic script that males walk with their left foot forward. So by showing the foot up, that shows again that he's coming back to life and is ready to walk.
Okay, great, thank you. And someone had a question about the Osiris festival. So would average Egyptian citizens have their own dedication to Osiris, their own artistic a figurine in their homes? You had mentioned at one point in your presentation that only priests had access to certain artistic renderings. I was wondering if you could speak to the everyday Egyptian and what they would do in their own homes.
Well, the ceremonies that I described are taking place largely in isolation in the temple. Mm-hmm. But the conclusion after day 26, all that work is done. Mm-hmm. And then public activities begin to take place, including the raising up of the Jed column, which would be visible to a large group of individuals. And we do have examples at Dendera and Edfu, another major temple, of large-scale festivals which take place for public viewing. So there are other ceremonies, and the conclusion of the Khoiak festivals would actually have a component for visible activity to humans. And any private individual could buy an Osiris statuette or an amulet, or of course you could make one for yourself out of mud. There's nothing about creating these figures that couldn't be done by private individuals. We don't have examples that are known from private individuals, but it only takes mud, watering, and some seeds.
And you know, the questions are just rolling in now. You may have mentioned this, Dr. Ritner, but what time of year is the festival held?
It's at the time when the waters are beginning to recede, and that is in our calendar, that would be it would be now, late October, early November. So this talk is precisely on point.
Well, I wish I could say that we planned it that way. Our calendars aligned for many reasons. Seeing a couple of other questions, going back to the canopic jars that you were just referencing, do you know if the jars were actually hollow? You know, in the statuettes that you showed us today, were they hollow to hold the water?
Well, some of these would be dummy vessels representing the god. However, the examples that you see in Rome, I suspect those actually had water in them that was imported. But water is assumed to be inside them, which is why, of course, it's so holy that you can't actually touch it with your hands. All the examples show the people holding cloth over their fingers so as not to profane the sacred image.
Great. This is wonderful. Well, maybe just two final ones, and I think this is more for our understanding. You showed a lot of great line drawings that made the depictions of these artifacts a little bit clearer. So someone had a question about the numerals that were included in the drawings. Could you speak to what those refer to?
Well, the line drawings that I showed you are from a modern publication of these Dendera chapels. And so some of those numbers go back to the man Chassinon, who was the first French scholar who actually gathered together the texts and translated them and discussed them. And he identified the scenes in order. And that's what those numbers refer to. If they're Roman numerals, they refer to the major scenes. But within those scenes, there are a whole series of texts. And so those are given line numbers. And the more recent publication is by a woman by the name of Coville, again, French. And she has done, Sylvie Coville, she has done a full edition of all of, well, almost all of the Temple of Dendera, actually, but there's 2 volumes dedicated just to these roof chapels. She also has a guide to the Temple of Dendera, and I highly recommend it, although it is only in French. But this little guide has a whole chapter about the roof chapels and explains them in great detail.
Great. Well, and this will be a great question to conclude our program on, but you did a wonderful job of bringing in the fact that these objects are all over the world. So I was wondering if you could speak to the fact that these objects are in the British Museum, they are in French collections. Are there ongoing discussions between the two governments to return things? Is there any kind of surface level answer you can provide as to where these artifacts are?
Well, these little mummies of Osiris are sufficiently common that no one is actually asking for them back. But they left Egypt for the British Museum, the Louvre, etc., very, very early when they were still allowed export of objects. In fact, at one point, the Cairo Museum actively sold off pieces that it didn't want, things that were extras. So they've all appeared in museum collections legally. It's not an issue.
Wonderful. Well, thank you. And I know we're grateful to have this exhibition on view in Richmond as well. So we are so grateful to you for your presentation today. This was wonderful, and to really give a lot of the visitors things to look for when they come to the museum to see the exhibition. Peter, would you like to say anything?
I'd like to thank Professor Ritner once again, and you, Izzy, but also all of the audience who came on a Sunday afternoon. Thank you for supporting the museum. Our next lecture is in 2 weeks, and also on a Sunday afternoon. And I'd encourage you to come and hear about underwater archaeology at that point. Okay.
Absolutely. And in fact, when this program ends, when we end the webinar, you will be automatically redirected to a survey on your experience today. Please do provide feedback. We love hearing it. You will also go to our Sunken Cities lecture page, where you will find our next lecture occurring on Sunday, November 13th with Dr. Pierce Paul Kriesman. So I hope you can join us then. Thank you all, and thank you, Dr. Ritner.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
Wonderful. All right. Bye, everybody.